This is outrageous! I want you to put a stop to this right now!
Hello, welcome again to Bert's Books, where this time we are going to be moving into slightly uncharted waters. We are going to be looking into the world of the soap opera spin-off novel, and where better to start with this than with a tie-in from mid-1990s Brookside, surely at the time Britain's most pioneering soap opera, which it was for much of its run. Phil Redmond's show through the mid-90s was inarguably at one of its peaks, running a series of highly memorable and often controversial storylines, which ensured that when the series would be looked back on after its unfortunate demise, the mid-1990s is the period that many of us by default will wax nostalgic over. David Bing Crosbie, as channelled by the wonderful John Burgess, is one of the series' more atypical figures. As a more senior cast member, David's upper middle class mores, his officer class bearing, and his slightly delusional yet deeply held self-image as an upstanding pillar of the community and a self-appointed guardian of moral decency instantly distinguished him from the more scallyish hijinks that would unfold on the close during his tenure. Bing, as he's nicknamed by wisecracking local retailer Ron Dixon, Bing is defined by his quaintness, and while he's prone to frequent misjudgments and misunderstandings, he's ultimately mostly a well-meaning sort of chap. Written in character, as if recorded by Bing himself, this novel, by Rachel Braverman, the author of a number of Brookside spin-offs, covers the bulk of 1995. Chronologically, this starts off at a point at which certain significant story threads are still in relatively recent history. Jimmy Corkhill, for instance, has come through the desperate period of drug addiction which he's remembered for, but he's a long way from rehabilitated in the eyes of many of his neighbours. Over in the Jordache household, meanwhile, Mandy's abusive husband Trevor is believed to be out of the picture. Well, yes and no. And her eldest daughter Beth's sexuality, the handling of which was one of the soap's pioneering motifs, is now common knowledge in the close, an issue on which Bing has shown himself up to be either a man of his generation or just a ragingly intolerant knobhead. Anyhow, we open with a typically self-important foreword in which Bing outlines his local responsibilities and declares that the time is ripe to publish his reminiscences, a tale of murder, mystery and intrigue. And we're off into the January entry on the highly important local issue of that carbuncle of society, Jimmy Corkhill, whose dog Cracker is shitting all over the place, a matter which Bing is seething over when his attention is drawn to the presence of police outside the Jordache's front door. Bing immediately suspects one of Jimmy's trademark break-ins, and being chairman, as he never fails to point out, of the local residents committee, appoints himself to investigate. It turns out the Bankses next door have had flooding issues and have dug beneath some paving stones next door in the Jordache's absence, and there, neatly tucked up in plastic bin liners and tape, are some mortal remains rotting away beneath the slabs. The following day it's all police cordons and a swarm of journalists. A rubbernecking Bing catches Cracker right in the act of coiling one down while her oblivious owner is gawping merrily at the Bobby's activities while pondering selling his story to the journos. Incensed, Bing immediately summons the Brookside Residents Association, that's BRA, to a meeting, which is co-hosted at Casa Beveron. Bing takes it upon himself to liaise with the authorities, from where the rumour filters through that the body is, in fact, Mandy Jordache's husband Trevor, who she'd come to the close with her daughters to flee from, who Bing has down as a nasty piece of work. The ID is confirmed in February, and the close becomes besieged by tabloid vultures, who gain a vantage point for photography that can only have been attained with the cooperation of the Bankses at number 9. Eddie Banks sees the error of his ways and forks over Fleet Street's money to the BRA, but Jimmy, meanwhile, intends to sup with the devil for a bit of cash in his pocket. While he's arguing with Bing about this, Cracker slips her leash and dashes through the police cordon, and to everybody's horror and to the press pack's delight, she re-emerges with a large bone in her jaws. This is subsequently revealed to be nothing more than a lamb bone, while Jimmy has managed to get himself lauded in the tabloids as some kind of local hero. Bing gets himself involved in some unscheduled animal rescue with Bev, which is eclipsed by the news that Mandy, Beth and Sinbad have been tracked down and arrested in Ireland, leaving the youngest of the family, Rachel, 15 years old, with no place to call home. Another BRA meeting is then called, at which Bing winds up with the unenviable task of handling the press intrusion. No small task now as they're swarming over the close. Bing takes small consolation in the fact that Jimmy's flirtation with Fleet Street has backfired. They've dug up some dirt on him and dealt out a regular character assassination. Sinbad, meanwhile, has been let off the hook on the Jordache case, leaving Mandy and Beth in the frame for murder. However, they're both shortly out on bail and holed up at Barry Grant's. Jimmy, meanwhile, has continued to gab to the press, causing Bing to confront him in the street. But Jimmy's laconic front is punctured by the arrival of the Bizzies, who bundle Jimmy, Bing has happily put the finger on him, into their squad car to answer queries relating to his time living at the address that is now universally known as the House of Hell. This leaves Bing, rather unexpectedly, as the custodian of Cracker, a situation he finds himself curiously at ease with, and he sets out to teach her some lavatorial etiquette. Meanwhile, the Jordaches have slipped back into number 10, but the Rags have now got wind of Beth's lesbianism and are having a field day with it. Bing's a bit conflicted here. While thoroughly disapproving of their muckraking, he's already revealed himself to be a bit of an arsehole over what he considers to be Beth's deviant sexuality. And this triggers recollections for him of the previous year's bust-up with his wife Jean over her revelation that she had had an experimental period in her younger days, a rift which drove Bing into the arms of one of his biggest mistakes, the arch-harpy Audrey Manners. Jimmy is shortly released without charges, so Bing has to relinquish Cracker, and he's off to a conference in Brighton, a jaunt to which Audrey Manners tries to invite herself, which further triggers his guilty memories. At this point, Jean is unaware of all such indiscretions. Come March, and Bing's back from his conference to find out that Jean has been conned out of a few £100s by Audrey's mysterious husband, who has emerged out of nowhere, having long been believed dead. He soon follows up on that, though, by dropping dead, having succumbed to a mysterious virus which he's brought back from his travels. Weird, eh? And which swiftly begins to work its way around the close. Bing, together with Mick Johnson, takes on the task of the local fight back against this bug. Audrey Manners has now succumbed, and Jean has exposed herself to the risk by going around and doing errands for her while she's ill, a task which Bing has understandably swerved. By mid-March, this is all starting to look a bit serious. Max and Patricia's son, Bing's grandson, Thomas, is now being checked into the hospital with it. The culmination of this drama is that Jean herself takes a turn, collapses and finds herself bedbound. Environmental health officers soon take an interest, and although Jean seems to experience a partial recovery, Dr. Horton appears and insists that a BRA meeting is held and confirms that the spate of illnesses can officially be laid at the door of a highly contagious virus. The area will need to be cordoned off, and just as the meeting starts to get heated, Jimmy turns up to warn Bing that Jean has now taken a turn for the worse. It turns out Cracker slipped her lead and headed to Jean's kitchen at the whiff of sausages. David is immediately on vigil duty for Jean, while a mysteriously absent Barry Grant's place has been requisitioned as an unofficial waiting area for the mobile health clinic that's been set up. Audrey Manners, meanwhile, dies. Bing ruminates that he certainly wanted her out of his hair, but not like this, while Jean is devastated, promptly relapsing but refusing to go into hospital with it. By the end of the month, it looks like she's near the end, and one night, while she's seemingly comatose, Bing breaks down and confesses the whole Manners affair to her unconscious form. Exhausted, Bing then falls asleep to find Jean cold and inanimate. The next morning, he assumes the worst, but to everyone's surprise, Jean opens her eyes and demands a cup of tea. While naturally relieved, Bing is also in a bit of a blue funk. Could Jean have processed what he'd told her last night? By the end of the month, the epidemic is over, but Bing is not out of the woods, as Jean icily confronts him over his confession, which of course she's heard and digested all along, then proceeding to give him the silent treatment for some weeks. Early in April, Beth and Mandy appear at the door to deliver some flowers, which of course reactivates all of Bing's deep-seated prejudices. This in turn provokes a fiery tongue-lashing from Jean. Fortunately for him, she decides to let him off the hook, and he's back in on the undertaking of complete honesty from now on. It's not long before they find themselves with a house guest in the shape of Rachel Jordache, who's still holding out loyalty towards her father in spite of everything. She's fled the family home on the revelation at her 16th birthday party that her mum mum is now pregnant, courtesy of Sinbad. Nice one, Sin. Although Bing is initially not too keen on this arrangement, Rachel proves to be no trouble as a house guest. Bing relents and reconciles himself, settling into their loco parentis role and settling down for a family evening in. Bing pulls out the Scrabble set from the loft, which also yields up Patricia's teenage skeletons, namely a heap of Bay City Rollers paraphernalia. Bing never could stand that song, Bang a Gang. But thus inspired, Bing sets off to town the next day in search of some posters of the latest hip cats in the hit parade to brighten Rachel's room up with. He comes home with something grunge related, and we don't find out who, only to learn that Rachel considers them to be sad smellies. While Mandy and Beth's trial date is set for May, Rachel announces that she plans to chuck school in on the basis she'll now need to be out and earning a wage as soon as possible. She's on a vow of silence with her mother now, and Bing and Jean can only hope that they can bring her round. It turns out that Rachel has been summoned as a witness, and this is where Bing learns of the molestation accusations against Trevor, which he finds all too credible, but which Rachel, while still conflicted on this issue, strenuously denies. For distraction, Bing goes in for a most unlikely impulse purchase, which is Eddie Banks's Harley Davidson. Rachel is keen for a pillion ride. Bing has to put the maiden voyage on hold, though, as he and Jean have to accompany Rachel to the Crown prosecution for the ordeal of questioning. Home afterwards, Bing is beginning to wonder if he's not made a bit of a rash purchase. By late April, the bike is back with Eddie again, and Bing's late life crisis is through this particular phase. Although one knock-on effect of this is that Rachel is beginning to take an interest in engineering and has agreed to return to school. It turns out that Rachel's history curriculum takes in World War II, which of course brings childhood memories flooding back for Bing. And as 1995 is a significant anniversary, a street party is planned for May. Bing and various others throw themselves into the preparations. The subject does have thorny associations for Bing, because he's been guilty of gross exaggeration as to his father's wartime doings. In fact, Crosbie Sr. was a Conchie, a whey-faced lily liver, whose decision had caused Bing to be bullied at school. Worse still, Jimmy Corkhill has wrangled himself an invitation. On a brighter note, Carl Banks, an ex-soldier himself, has promised to fix a delivery of a tank, if only an inflatable one, for the event. As the day draws nearer, though, Carl's other promised deliverable, a supply of beer, all turns out to be of a German brand, which Bing deems unacceptable, and an alternate supply must be found. Anyhow, the party gets off to a good start, but Bing has a fair old turn when someone from the Legion shows up and blows his cover about his dad, forcing him to break down and confess his fabrications. You mean he was a minor, not a major? Bing's position is somewhat retrieved, however, when it transpires that Ron's supposedly highly decorated father was actually in the catering corps and did all his killing with beef stew. There's no mention of the Jimmy Corkhill fancy dress incident. That may have been another party. But shortly after this, Bing makes a dreadful faux pas, assuming a new arrival to be Mandy's sister and commenting on her brute of a husband. It turns out that it's Trevor's sister, Brenna, an almost equally malign presence who's come to exhort the still malleable Rachel into standing up for her father at the forthcoming trial. Bing and Mick go along for a gallery seat and witness the drama unfurl. Tense proceedings which fail to go Beth and Mandy's way, Rachel's testimonial hardly helping their cause. On the morning of the verdict, it transpires that Auntie Brenna had been responsible for some hate mail which Beth had somehow concluded that Bing was responsible for, and a confrontation with her in the cafeteria is followed by the bombshell of a verdict that they're both found guilty. Bing is swift to drum up a BRA meeting in order to mobilise an appeal. Most of the close are behind it and are willing to mobilise. Rachel, meanwhile, is still in a state somewhere between denial and confusion on the whole thing, and elects to focus just on her upcoming exams. As the appeal campaign gets into full swing, with Jean and Patricia involving themselves in vigils and petitions to the extent that Jean is arrested for fly posting, Rachel's state of denial and condemnation of her mother and sister is ongoing. She continues her residence at the Crosbies but stays largely in her shell. Patricia, Jackie Corkhill and Jean, meanwhile, are invited onto Michael Parkinson's TV show to air their case, in which Patricia's cornered into agreeing that she'd do her own husband in under the same circumstances. Max, who's watching with Bing, goes apeshit, as does Jackie, on camera, provoked by the chauvinistic attitude of a smarmy MP on the panel. In the meantime, Trevor's body is released, although Brenner is curiously remiss in notifying Rachel, who's nevertheless determined to be at the burial ceremony. But mysteriously she changes her mind at the last minute. It's becoming increasingly clear that Rachel has something on her mind. Jean tries to inquire whether her dad's affection ever overstepped the boundaries, but Rachel is evasive, although later, in an unguarded moment, she questions Bing over his own familial relationships, wondering, why do people keep telling me what my dad did was wrong? Bing presses further on this, but can't quite get the story out of her. But he's clear now that she must have lied to the court, and that Jean and himself must get to the bottom of it. This isn't straightforward, as her loyalty to Trevor runs deep. One night, Bing comes home to find Rachel leafing through a stack of mysterious letters. They're private, she tells him, and whisks them out of sight. Some days later, Bing is on a quest for some photos and happens to nose through Rachel's room and uncovers her secret folder, which include letters from Trevor with references to a little secret. Naturally, soap opera laws of physics dictating, Rachel catches him prying and throws a fit. Bing is in the shithouse, but his moral compass is twitching. Rachel loses her bag on the bus one morning, and it's returned by Rosie Banks to Bing, who can't help but have a further nose. There's a letter on prison notepaper which all but spells out what was going on between them. And this puts Bing and Jean in a quandary about what to do about this. Rachel, of course, rumbles them for prying and gives them a good bout of the silent treatment. Meanwhile, the scale and the unruliness of the protests have pushed the authorities into transferring Beth and Mandy to another prison, this time in Yorkshire. Eventually, Rachel comes round and resolves to confront the reality of her relationship with her dad. Her letters are soon in the hands of the solicitors, and the painful process of a psychiatrist's report and a fresh affidavit from Rachel are put into motion. A hearing date is fixed for late July, and the psychiatrist on Rachel's case is now convinced that she's being truthful. There's some light relief as Bing and Sinbad undertake an ill-fated car journey to visit Mandy and Beth in Yorkshire. Bing's old faithful Cortina throwing a mechanical wobbler, and his homespun fix at a boiled egg in the radiator, failing to plug the leak. What follows next, however, comes as the greatest shock of all. Beth's unexpected death from a generic heart condition in prison, another of Trevor's legacies. This renders Mandy's vindication and subsequent release something of a bittersweet victory, and it was a proper bummer for Brookside viewers all over, for whom Anna Friel's Beth was a hard act to follow. By August, things seem to have become a bit calmer on the close. Mandy and Rachel have become close again, and Beth is bid farewell to in a highly emotional ceremony. However, the surviving Jordaches now have to contend with Auntie Brenner on their doorstep, who, in a sinister coda to her brother's activities, worms her way through their door and proceeds to attempt to poison Mandy and Sinbad. As Jimmy has also somehow established himself in the household, he's also been chowing on Brenner's cooking and makes no bones about publicising the consequent state of his bowels. Brenner succeeds in writing off Mandy and Sin's wedding day before she's finally rumbled and sent packing, a day from which Mick Jono, the best man, is conspicuous by his absence, having fallen foul, as we subsequently learn, of his long-term stalker Jenny, a situation that doesn't resolve itself until the local Bobby takes an interest and gets himself shot in the arm by Jenny for his pains. Jimmy, meanwhile, has moved into Sinbad's old place and set up a hooky cab service, and also put in a bid for Barry's share in the restaurant. Oh, where did that money come from? In which Max would have to endure him as a partner. Bing, meanwhile, involves himself in a lottery syndicate with the Bankses, which goes sour when their numbers come in on a week that he's away, and which Rachel has forgotten to hand over that week's contribution. After considerable pressure, the Bankses agree to back down reluctantly and fork over 50 grand, for which Jean plans an adventure holiday, an ambition she's committed to and a source of tension between her and her spouse, while Bing eyes up some new tea towels. Amid the arguments, Mandy pops up to say her goodbyes. She's taking a residential job at a women's refuge, which spells the end of her relationship with Sinbad. As Mandy's taxi pulls away, Bing, nearing the end of this volume, ponders on the closing of this particular chapter and his intention to have his documentations published for posterity. Rachel Braverman has kept very true to the feel and spirit of the show with this book, striking a balance between the day-to-day trivialities of close life and the more serious, dark as hell plot lines that the show would frequently tackle. Altogether, it's a pretty authentic reflection on the spirit of the show at one of its peaks, and I got a real nostalgic glow out of it.
Now all we've got to do is rally a bit more support.
Come on, Cracks girl.